So, James, over the past few weeks, there's been a lot going on in the Middle East.
There has, mate.
Could you please elaborate and inform us of what's been happening?
So over the last 3 weeks or so, I think the last time we did a kind of a major update on the Middle East was probably late last year. And obviously with the ceasefire being implemented between Israel and Gaza, we've had, should we say, a cooling of tensions over the last few months.
Yep.
So I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that have been going on the last few weeks and specifically the last few days that are indicating that this lull in hostility is not there anymore.
Yep.
And we are seeing huge escalations on many fronts. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about Syria. Obviously, as we covered quite comprehensively towards the end of last year, the government of Bashar al-Assad was overthrown by the foreign-backed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, al-Qaeda forces led by Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, or Ahmed al-Shara, as his moniker is. So, really kind of capturing the revolutionary zeal of like a Che Guevara type character. However, funnily enough, in Syria itself, his government hasn't actually been very popular. So despite all the kind of pretenses of democracy that they've been using, we're getting rid of the old dictator, a democracy for all Syrians, it appears that his followers, specifically his HTS followers, do not want that at all. And lots of the Syrian people do not want that at all. Because you've had a couple weeks ago, you had essentially kind of a coordinated series of attacks on HTS forces, which is they are the government forces, by people that were described as being pro-Assad forces. I don't think they were necessarily pro-Assad forces. I think they were just maybe people that didn't like al-Qaeda. So this happened specifically in the kind of northwestern section of Syria, in the coastal region.
This is along the Mediterranean?
Along the Mediterranean. Kind of, yeah. So that's the main, that was where the intensity of it was. And that's also where there is a large portion of the Alawite minority. They mainly inhabit that area there. So there was a series of attacks on HTS forces, and for about a week or so there was quite a bit of fighting. The entire Syrian military, the HTS, there was a state of emergency, the entire military was mobilised. And we saw from there, in response to this violence and ambush on the al-Qaeda forces, the government al-Qaeda forces, we saw a huge spate of ethnic cleansing and killing of civilians. So there was lots of really horrible stuff happening. For example, we had the al-Qaeda forces going from, I will call them al-Qaeda forces because it's less of a mouthful than saying Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or clarifying that they are the Syrian government. They are al-Qaeda. I personally saw a lot of footage, which we would not put up here at all, of mass killings, extrajudicial executions, for example, people going door to door asking people if they were Alawi or Shia, and then subsequently executing them, rounding up people, making them walk on all fours like dogs, making them howl before executing them. It's estimated that over, I think, about 7,000 plus people were killed in this spate of violence over about a week and a bit. Lots of the minority population in that area fled towards the Russian airbase, the Khmeimim airbase, I believe it's called, where the Russians took them in, and offered them some sort of protection. Since then, the situation, like whatever little uprising or rebellion, has since been quelled. However, what's happened since is we've had HTS forces engage with Lebanese armed forces across the border in Lebanon. So what we've seen is Syrian forces fire rockets into Lebanon and try to cross the border, when they were subsequently killed by Lebanese forces. And this is a combination of the Lebanese army and various Shia militias. I do not believe Hezbollah, though. And then we saw, Syria essentially ramp up and say, look what the Lebanese are doing. They're attacking us. We need to start attacking them. This was a bit of an incident that was kind of subsequently the HTS government in Syria and the Lebanese government, quickly kind of got together to undertake talks. So that is kind of what's been happening in Lebanon and Syria
Yeah.
over the last few weeks.
Can I just stop you there
Yes.
for 1 second? I'm curious. So you're telling me that the Salafist jihadists,
Yes.
the West back to topple Assad,
Yes.
haven't brought a stable and liberal democracy to the people of Syria?
No, they haven't.
Okay,
Yeah.
and that's something that we have been discussing here for
Yes.
quite some time?
Yes,
Okay.
and I think someone like, again, you talked about your predictions with AUKUS. I
Yeah.
think I also predicted this was most likely to happen when
Yes.
you give Al-Qaeda control of a government.
Yeah. So they're going around now and basically attacking and suppressing all of the different minority groups within inside Syria.
Yes. It's important to note it hasn't happened much in Damascus because I think Damascus being the administrative centre of the country, and that's where lots of the media, etc., is. They want to kind of keep that looking nice and friendly, but especially in the Latakia region, like I was saying, that has been underway.
Yeah.
One side thing to note as well is there was footage of Syrian soldiers dropping barrel bombs on civilian neighbourhoods. A barrel bomb is just a bomb. It's essentially like a barrel full of petrol.
And they're dropping them out of planes.
Dropping them out of helicopters and planes. Yes. Hilarious to note that this was one of the main things the Western media criticised the Assad government for, is you're dropping barrel bombs on civilians,
Yeah.
even though lots of the time they were dropping barrel bombs on Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
Not a peep from
No.
Western media. Not a peep. So
Yeah.
all the people, the liberals, the liberal media, across the whole kind of spectrum that continually supported these moderate rebels who were very obviously ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated and funneled them billions of dollars of weapons. This is what happens at the end of the day. And it's horrible. It truly is disgusting. It makes me sick. It makes me very upset.
Yeah.
And I think it's only going to lead towards more instability in the region.
Yeah.
They have essentially proved their utility to the state of Israel by essentially allowing Israel to occupy large tracts of land in Syria. Israel repeatedly bombs whatever's left of the military capability in Syria. They occupied the highest point in Syria. I believe it's called Mount Hermon. They've expanded their reach past the already occupied Golan Heights. They occupy about 40% of Syria's water resources.
Yeah.
And they essentially have a strategic position overlooking the capital city, Damascus, which they are bombing at will.
Yeah.
What has the HTS government done in Syria? They refuse to even acknowledge that Israel is their enemy, and they turn around and go and kill Shias in Lebanon.
Yeah.
So that shows who they're working for.
Yeah.
Again.
So that's what's been happening in Syria.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, Israel has obviously been bombing facilities and annexing parts of Syria.
Yeah.
And just recently, the ceasefire that was orchestrated between Hamas and Israel has just broken down.
Yes, correct.
So I would like to ask you, first of all, why do you think that broke down?
Well, I hate to be too cynical,
Yeah.
but I think the Israelis never wanted to implement the ceasefire. I think there's a few things at play. I think they needed to allow Donald Trump to come into the White House and not have just a war.
Yep.
You know, not have an open conflict, because even if you wait 2 weeks, but you can't just be sworn in as the president. I also think their military forces were well and truly depleted.
Yep.
I think they didn't their capacity to actually wage war, as not just like bomb civilians, which they are happy to do, but they actually send troops in on the ground
To occupy and fight.
I
Yep.
think they'd really lost the resolve, because they had honestly from what I'm not a military man, but from what I can see is whether it was in Lebanon or in Gaza, the Israeli military was getting its ass handed to them, and suffering very high casualties. And being an occupying force, you're never going to have that same level of conviction that the indigenous inhabitants of South Lebanon or of Gaza
Yep.
would have. So I think they needed time to reevaluate, give Trump a little bit of leeway as well politically.
Yeah.
However, what has happened is I want to talk about the ceasefire a little bit, because in the last week or so, the ceasefire has completely broken down.
Yep.
So, I mean, not to mention the fact that Israel, I believe, has violated, before this mutual breakdown that we've had in the last couple of days, Israel, I think, violated the ceasefire over 900 times. And they've also been attacking Lebanon consistently, attacking Palestine consistently, whether it's Gaza or the West Bank. So I did want to talk about, look, originally, if we go back about 2 weeks, they essentially they had this ceasefire worked out in stages. So you're going to complete stage 1 before you move on to stage 2, for example.
Yeah.
So stage 1 consisted of releasing 25 Israeli hostages, 5 Thai hostages in exchange for roughly 2,000 Palestinians. However, the US actually stepped in directly after that first stage because there was, I believe, an Israeli-American citizen that was held hostage, and so they wanted to negotiate directly. I think the purpose of that was to give the Netanyahu government a little bit of leeway, for example, so they can say, oh, look, if they break down, it's the Americans, not us, and then the Americans can do the same thing with them also. It's interesting to note I believe he was on CNN in the United States, the man who was originally undertaking the hostage negotiations, he was talking to everyone's favourite liberal establishment journalist Jake Tapper, and he was talking to Jake Tapper, and he was like, look, essentially the thing is about, I'm paraphrasing him, but he goes, look, the thing is about this is that we're treating Hamas not like they have horns, they're just normal people like you and me, they're pretty nice guys, and we have to remember the US has our own interests. We don't work for Israel, we have our own interests that we have to achieve. Shortly after that interview, he was subsequently removed from the negotiating team. I wonder why. Hilarious. So what's happened is essentially Israel, they blockaded all food and aid going to the Gaza Strip, and that was one of the main stipulations. So they never fulfilled that fundamental basic condition of the ceasefire. So that's one of the reasons why I think, they never wanted to have the ceasefire. Look, their goal is still to wipe the Palestinian population out of Israel, whether that's killing them all or ethnically cleansing them to a neighbouring country. That's their goal. And I think once you understand that's the end goal, then nothing else is really particularly confusing. None of the intricacies along the way. So they blockaded all food into the Gaza Strip. And then that elicited a response from the Ansar Allah government in Yemen, whose leader, Sayed Abdul Malik al-Houthi, said, if the Zionists do not stop violating the ceasefire deal in Gaza by refusing to allow the entry of humanitarian aid, Yemen will resume naval operations against Israel. Yemen has informed the mediators in Qatar and Egypt that Israel has 4 days to comply or the Red Sea blockade will resume. Israel did not cease their blockade. Yemen started their blockade. That was seen, Donald Trump then came out and in his typical kind of boisterous boomer fashion kind of came out and said, the Yemenis are, attacking whatever rhetoric he was using, our Israeli allies, attacking American interests, and we will, I think he said something along the lines, we'll rain down all hell upon you. And so the US has subsequently proceeded to start bombing Yemen.
You could basically say that Ansar Allah, the government of Yemen, have been enacting a humanitarian blockade. In support of the Palestinians.
To my knowledge, I'm not an international lawyer, but to my knowledge, if there is atrocities underway, the likes of which Israel are committing in Gaza, then your nation has the legal obligation to do what they can to prevent such atrocities from happening. So Yemen...
So the I'm pretty sure it's called R2P, the right to protect.
Right to protect,
which comes under international humanitarian law.
Absolutely. And it's quite amusing because I think we've talked about this before, but that's the kind of the excuse that the Americans have used in pretty much every conflict where they've just, Syria, Libya, Serbia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Oh, I've got to protect these people. Hilarious.
But this actually is to stop a legitimate genocide.
Yes, correct. So the United States have proceeded to bomb Yemen heavily over the last few days. In response, Yemen has just started launching more missiles back at Israel. So the Houthi government, or the Ansar Allah government, has announced that Ben Gurion International Airport, which is the main international airport in Israel, their goal is to shut that down. I don't believe they have actually landed any successful missiles yet, but they are essentially enacting an aerial blockade.
Targeting it,
At the same time as this has happened, the Israelis have launched a brutal spate of bombings across the Gaza Strip. They destroyed I believe it's called the Turkish hospital, which is...
sorry, just to stop you, this is in the past week now?
Yes, this is in the past week. We're catching up.
Have started launching mass airstrikes into the Gaza Strip.
Yes. In one night, one air raid, they killed 400 people. I believe the number's over 700 now. And they are continuing to bomb northern Gaza specifically. They blew up Gaza's last remaining cancer hospital.
Yep.
I believe it was called the Turkish Palestinian Friendship Hospital or something like that. They destroyed that as they claimed that it was being used by Hamas, as they do. Funny to note, they had been occupying said hospital, IOF forces, for the last year. They've put troops back into the ground on the Netzarim corridor.
Yep.
And they have also started bombing Lebanon again.
Mm-hmm.
This is very scary because I believe they have taken their time off to... This is just my opinion. We're not really talking about the facts. This is my opinion. I believe that they have essentially reconsolidated their strategy. And I believe that given what they have said recently and a lot of rhetoric in the United States itself, particularly by Donald Trump, about the necessity to attack Iran,
yep.
I believe they are going to start implementing this. So I think they're using Gaza Strip as a tripwire for Yemen,
yep.
and then Yemen as a tripwire for Iran.
Okay.
Because as all kind of American neocons have said, Iran is the main baddie that we need to get rid of. Donald Trump has actually said, I believe in another boisterous tweet or whatever you call them, Truth Social post,
yep.
has said every single thing that happens to Yemen is the fault of Iran because Iran supports them.
Yep.
I believe Iran have actually come out and said we didn't know the Houthis were going to do this. We've kind of told them to stop. We do not need this now. But they are not our subordinate. They are their own independent country.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, look, I think it's going to be we had a brief respite for the people of the Middle East.
Yep.
I think that is over, and I think there is going to be long, protracted, violent conflict.
Yep.
With no positive end in sight.
Yeah. So what has been coinciding internally in Israel? Because has there not been tens of thousands of people demonstrating inside Israel against the Netanyahu government?
Against the Netanyahu government. And there are a lot of Israelis domestically who, they've been protesting this entire time.
But just recently in the past few days.
And also they want the return of the hostages. I think it's quite common. It's pretty common knowledge that Netanyahu doesn't have any intention of returning the hostages.
Because it allows the war to continue.
Also very important to note, Bibi Netanyahu is in a lot of trouble in Israel. He is still being investigated for corruption.
Weaponising the judiciary, I believe.
Weaponising the judiciary. There's a whole list of things that he has done that he is being investigated for. He was due to appear in court in Israel the day that they started resuming their bombing in Gaza.
Yep.
So as long as they can keep the war going, Netanyahu will stay out of trouble. And I wanted to talk a little bit as well about when you have a political figure who's dominant in that country's politics for a long period of time.
Yeah.
You essentially hollow out all opposition. So Bibi's pretty much, for the last 25 plus years, 30 years, he's been the dominant force in Israeli politics. Obviously, you had Naftali Bennett came in for a little bit. In between Bibi and Bibi, you had Bennett come in. But no one's been able to hold a coalition together in Israel apart from Bibi. So if he gets arrested and he has to step down as prime minister, the government... They will not be able to form a government and the government will collapse. So there's a real, due to their own internal issues, there's a real necessity for them to keep Bibi in power. What's the way to do that? Obviously, is keep the war going. The United States cannot afford, they will always approve of everything Israel does because they cannot afford to have their unsinkable aircraft carrier collapse internally, which it is. And there are a lot of unhappy people in Israel. We can say what we want about the things that the Israeli population has said and their opinions, but at the end of the day, they might have very negative opinions of their neighbours, but at the end of the day, they do not want to go to war for the most part. They want the hostages back and they don't want to have to send their kids off to die.
Yeah, of course,
Will that matter in the long run? Probably not. So I think, we will be continually covering this story, but unfortunately, I think there will be only escalation in the future.
Okay, interesting.
Which is terrifying, Jordie.
It's
absolutely terrifying.
It is.
Because, I think war's bad for everyone.
No,
it's not bad for everyone. If you're Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or, the big contractors or just one of those evil, ghoulish, Zyocons. If you're like a Lindsey Graham type character who I think made a blood pact with some sort of ancient deity to provide him with, I'll provide you with the souls of 100,000 Middle Eastern kids every year if you let me into, whatever horrific things these people think.
All right. Well, no,
Sorry to end it on a sad note.
We'll keep following it, and I'll keep picking your very sharp brain on this subject as it unfolds over the next few weeks.
Cheers,
Thanks.
Mate. Appreciate it.